Hello, Year 11. This is a lesson for the week beginning the 2nd of November, and this is lesson 2 of your isolation period. So you've been studying Germany in transition 1919 to 1939, and this is your second lesson of the week. So the first thing I would like you to do, can you just pause the video, click the link in the video description, and you're going to do your low stakes quiz. So just pause this and open up the low stakes quiz, and I'll just give you, probably take about 3 minutes to do that, 3-4 minutes, using your knowledge organizer to help. So just do the low stakes quiz now. Okay, so you should have done the low stakes quiz. I'm going to go through the answers for that with you. So you'll be marking those and or thinking about what you wrote down, and then we'll get going with the lesson. So, who was not killed in the night of the long night? You should have put Hindenburg. How many members did the SA have by 1934? You should have put 2 million. How did the night of the long knives help Hitler secure power? It sent a message to other Nazis that disloyalty would be punished brutally. Which of these is not a Catholic belief? The monarch is head of the church. Which of these is not a Protestant belief? You should have put the Pope as head of the church. Okay, so you've been studying Germany in transition from 1919 to 1939, and at the moment we've been studying the consolidation of power. And this is your kind of consolidation lesson of the consolidation topic, because we're going to look back at what we've done so far. So we've been looking at what happens in this period here. So in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor, but there were still a number of barriers in his way to becoming a dictator. So how does he consolidate his power? How does he strengthen and solidify that power in this time period from 1933 to 1934? So what does he do to remove those barriers? So we're going to finish this off today. So can everybody in your notes, or wherever you wrote your low stakes quiz, this should be your title. So how did Hitler finally rise to Führer? And just write the date. You're doing this on different days this week, so just write the date that you're doing this lesson. You can pause the video if you need to. Okay, so you should have written the title and date. So how did Hitler finally rise to Führer? Now, we've been looking over the last few lessons at the barriers that he faced to becoming dictator. Now, one of the most important barriers was Hindenburg, and we're going to come to that, talk about that later in today's lesson. But the other barriers, we've already looked at how he removed those. So the Reichstag, this was a problem because the other parties in the Reichstag could work together to stop Hitler passing new laws. But what we've seen now is that Hitler removed this barrier. If you look at the right-hand side of my table, Hitler used the SA to put pressure on the Reichstag to pass the Enabling Act. This was passed, giving Hitler the power to bypass the Reichstag. Another barrier that Hitler still faced was the threat of the Communist Party. So they might win more seats in the future and challenge the Nazis in the Reichstag. So Hitler, though, has now managed to remove this barrier. Hitler convinced Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag fire decree, which restricted civil liberties such as freedom from arrest. Hitler then arrested 4,000 members of the Communist Party. And after the Enabling Act, the party was banned. So the Communist Party threat has been removed. Another barrier was the German people. Now, most Germans didn't support Hitler and they might vote against him. But again, we've now seen over the last few lessons that Hitler's removed this barrier. He used the Enabling Act to ban all political parties, so all German people would have to support him. The Enabling Act also allowed Hitler to set up the first concentration camps, and people who opposed Hitler could be sent there. And that sort of threat or the danger of that meant people were maybe more likely to support the Nazi Party and less likely to criticize Hitler. Another barrier, the trade unions. Now, they were a problem because they could call a general strike to stop Hitler taking power, as they'd done before with the Kapp Putsch. But again, the Enabling Act allowed Hitler to ban all trade unions, so that is no longer a problem for Hitler. And finally, what you looked at last lesson is how he removed the opposition of other Nazis. So a rival Nazi might challenge Hitler and become leader of the party instead. But as you saw last lesson, the Knight of the Long Knife removed Rome and sent a message to any other Nazi that disloyalty would be punished brutally. So that barrier to his power has been removed. Okay, so we're going to come back to Hindenburg in a moment, but the Reichstag communists, the Reichstag people, trade unions, and other Nazis, what I would like you to do is I'm just going to show you a number of statements, and can you just write whether these are true or false? So you're going to read each statement, write whether it's true or false. If it's false, can you correct the statement? So pause the video now and do the true or false. Okay, so hopefully now you've unpaused the video and we'll go through this. So, number one, the essay put pressure on the Reichstag to pass the Enabling Act. That's true. Number two, the Enabling Act reduced civil liberties, including freedom from arrest. That's false. That was the Reichstag fire decree. That was passed after the Reichstag fire, where the Nazi Party reduced civil liberties such they made it much easier to arrest the Communist Party, and they reduced the freedom of the press. Number three, the Enabling Act gave Hitler the power to bypass the Reichstag. That's true. Number four, Hitler banned trade unions in 1933. That's true. Number five, the Knight of the Long Knives removed Hindenburg. That's false. It removed Rome and 85 other political rivals. The Reichstag fire decree allowed Hitler to bypass the Reichstag. That's false. That was the Enabling Act. Okay, so making sure you've got that correct, ticking the ones you did, changing the ones now if you got them wrong, and you can pause the video if you need to do that. Okay, so the final barrier that we haven't spoken about yet, Hindenburg. Hitler had been appointed by President Hindenburg, but as president, Hindenburg still had the power to dismiss the Chancellor, Hitler, whenever he wished. So it's a challenge that Hitler needs to overcome. Well, in 1934, Hindenburg dies of old age. So there is no longer a president in place who has the power to dismiss Hitler. So it is at this stage that Hitler becomes the Führer. After Hindenburg dies in 1934, Hitler is no longer just the Chancellor, he is now the head of state. He has the title of Führer, and he's jointly the President, the Chancellor, and the head of the army. Now, one of the first things that Hitler does when he becomes a Führer is he makes the army swear an oath of loyalty or an oath of allegiance to Hitler. So an oath of allegiance, that's total loyalty to Hitler. So they didn't just swear an oath of allegiance to the country, but a personal oath of allegiance to support Hitler. Now, what I would like you to do is task one, complete the sentences following the death of Hindenburg, Hitler, what happened? Number 2, to secure the loyalty of the army, Hitler, what did he do? And then task 2, some historians argue that Hitler was lucky rather than skillful. So what's the evidence for that? So again, just pause the video and finish those tasks, and I'll show you my answers in a moment. Okay, we'll have a look at my sentences now so you can compare those to your own. Following the death of Hindenburg, Hitler declared himself head of state. He was now a dictator, or the Führer. To secure the loyalty of the army, Hitler made them swear an oath of loyalty, not to the country, but to him personally. And some historians argue that Hitler was lucky rather than skillful. What's the evidence for this? The evidence for this is that Hindenburg died of old age, and this did not require any skill on Hitler's part. So, back to this table that you've been filling in over the last few lessons. We've spoken about how the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act and the laws that came after the Enabling Act allowed Hitler to remove the barrier of the Reichstag, the communists, the German people not supporting him, trade unions, and other Nazis threatening his power. And now we've seen that final barrier that we hadn't looked at already, in August 1934, this is removed when Hindenburg dies. Okay, so this shows you how Hitler consolidated his power. He's removed all of those barriers, so by 1934, he is now the Führer. Okay, what we're going to do now is a question 4 practice. Now, question 4 will ask you to study the sources below and then answer the question which follows. The question is, which of the sources is more useful for an historian studying the Reichstag fire? And it says you should refer to both sources in your answer and use your knowledge and understanding of the historical context. So this question is all about the usefulness of sources. I've given 2 sources. So here there's source C, which is an extract from the memoirs of Rudolf Diels, head of the Berlin police in 1933, and source D, which is an extract from an article written by Sefton Delmer, a British journalist, the day after the Reichstag fire. So you're given 2 sources and you're asked a question about their usefulness. How useful are they? Which one is more useful to the historian? Okay. Now, this here shows you an archive. Now, an archive is where lots of historical sources are located. So historians will often go to an archive to access sources. They can also get sources in other places, but they use these sources to help them with their research. A wide range of different sources will be used by historians to help them research their area of interest or expertise. What I would like you to do, you're going to pause the video and write down what sources can you think of. So think about sources that we've read in class before. What types of sources do historians use in their research? So just pause the video and I'll give you some suggestions in a moment. Okay, so historians use a range of sources. Hopefully you've written down some ideas of your own. Here are a few that you can add. So some sources that historians use, they will use historical documents. They can use posters. This is an example of an election poster here from the Nazis. They can use photographs. You can see in the top right-hand corner. And in the bottom right-hand corner, they can use political cartoons. So those are just 4 different examples. Hopefully you came up with some other ones of your own, but you can be adding these ones to your list now. So what are the kinds of sources that historians use? Of course, there are lots of different types of written document, and we're going to be looking at some of those written documents today. So, with sources, it's important to understand that sources are useful for different things. Okay, so one historical source, so maybe a document, might give a historian lots of information about an event. A source might be useful because it might help us to understand what a key group did or what a person did. It might be useful in helping us to understand the attitudes, values, or concerns of a person or group. It might be useful for helping us understand the methods used by a person group to influence others. It might be useful to help us understand the reasons for an event or a point of view. Might give us information about a success or a failure, give us information about living or working conditions, the effects of something, the opinions of key people. It might tell us about the priorities of the government. It might help us to understand how a person or a group try to achieve a goal. It might help us to understand the private opinions of an individual, or it might help us to understand the message given to the public. Or it might help us to understand the influence of an idea or key event on other people or events. So there's lots of different things that a source can be useful for. And this question is all about thinking about, well, what can we learn from the source? What does the source help you to understand? So the question will ask you to compare two sources and think about which one is more useful. Now, you need to look at the question because it's what is it useful for? Now, in this case, I've highlighted in pink which of the sources is more useful for an historian studying the Reichstag fire. So which one will help a historian to understand this event better? Okay, so we're thinking about how are they going to help us answer this question or this research topic, finding out more about the Reichstag fire. Okay, if you had this in front of you, this would be the first thing you would annotate, that bit I've got highlighted in pink. Which of the sources is more useful for? In this case, we're trying to find out about the Reichstag fire. Now, in terms of how to structure question 4, it asks you to look at both sources and then answer which of the sources is more useful for a historian studying the Reichstag fire. So in paragraph 1, start with source C, and you're going to do one paragraph explaining why source C is useful. So start off by saying what we can learn from the source. Use evidence from the source, so quotes to support that. If it's an image or a photograph, you would use detail, but in a written source, can you use a quote? Then you expand on that with your own knowledge, and then you talk about how reliable the source is. Paragraph 2, you then move on to focus on source D and explain why source D is useful. So again, what do we learn from the source about the Reichstag fire? Use evidence from the source, so quotes. Use your own knowledge to expand on that. And then again, is the source reliable? And then a third paragraph where you make a judgment about which source is more useful. So let's have a look at doing paragraph 1 together. I'm going to talk you through it. You're going to have a go at writing paragraph 1. So we'll begin looking at source C. So let's look at the authorship first so we know what we're looking at. Now, source C is an extract from the memoirs of Rudolf Diels, head of the Berlin police in 1933. Now, Diel wrote his memoirs in 1950. So I'm looking at the authorship and I'm going to annotate it's a memoir. So a memoir is a personal account, a bit like a diary. and it's written by the head of the Berlin police, so would have been a supporter of the Nazis in 1933. And it's also written in 1950, so it's quite a while after the event. So those are the things that I notice when I look first at the authorship, so that information under the source that I've been given. Then I look at the content of the source itself. So what does the source say? So I'm now looking at the writing within the text box. Shortly after my arrival in the burning Reichstag, the Nazis arrived. On a balcony jutting out of the chamber, jutting means sort of pushing out, Hitler and his trusty followers were assembled. Goering told him, "This is the beginning of the communist revolt. They will start their attack now. Not a moment must be lost. There will be no mercy now." That means there'll be no sort of forgiveness at this point. Every communist official will be shot where he is found. Okay, so looking at this, how is this useful to a historian who is studying the Reichstag fire? What is this telling us about the Reichstag fire? So things to be thinking about are, what does this help us to understand? Okay, so begin by saying source C is useful because it helps us to understand what aspect of the Reichstag fire. And you can be looking at that table on the left to help you. So is it giving us key information about the event? Is it telling us about the methods used by an event? Is it telling us if it was a success? What is it telling us about the Reichstag fire? Then you use detail from the source. So what is the source telling us about that? The source suggests, because it states, can you use a quote from the source? After you've used the source, then expand on that with your own knowledge. Okay, so what is that supported by? Use your own knowledge of the Reichstag fire. And then finally, make a comment on whether or not the source is reliable. So the authorship does or does not make the source reliable because. I would like you to pause the video now and have a go at writing your first paragraph using the sentence starters if you need them. Okay, we can look at my example now and you compare that to your own. Source C is useful because it helps us to understand who the Nazis blamed for the Reichstag fire. The source suggests that the Nazis blamed the communists for starting the fire because Goering is quoted saying, "This is the beginning of the communist revolt." The source shows that the Nazis punished the communists harshly, as Goering says, "They will show no mercy to them." This is supported by the fact that van der Lubbe was caught red-handed at the fire, but the Nazi Party convinced the German public that he was not working alone and was part of a wider communist uprising. The Nazis used this as a reason to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which made it easy to arrest communists. The authorship of the source limits its reliability because it is part of a memoir that was written 17 years after the event. Also, in 1933, Rudolf Diels would have supported the Nazi Party and their version of events. That's the first paragraph. If you compare that to your own, have you said, why is this useful? What aspect of the Reichstag fire does this help us to understand? Have you used the source? Particularly, have you used a quote from the source? Have you used your own knowledge? And have you made a comment on how reliable the source is? Okay, we're going to look at source D now. Now, source D So we're looking at source D. Again, start by looking at the authorship. So this is an extract from an article written by Sefton Delmer, a British journalist, the day after the Reichstag fire. Delmer was with Hitler when he went to inspect the Reichstag. So already looking at this, we're noticing it's a British perspective, so maybe more willing to criticise the Nazi Party and their actions. Also, it's written immediately after the event. That's something we notice about the authorship. After you've looked at the authorship, now look at the content. So you're reading the text in the box. What do we learn about the Reichstag fire? The fire at the Reichstag was allegedly, that means apparently, or people said, the work of a communist Dutchman, van der Lubbe. More probably, the fire was started by the Nazis, who used the incident as an excuse to remove political opposition and impose dictatorship. The fire had been laid in 5 different corners, and there is no doubt whether that it was the handiwork of a group of arsonists. So it's used to impose dictatorship. So that means force dictatorship on people. And arsonists are people who set fire to things on purpose. So we're looking at this again. What does this tell us about the Reichstag fire? What aspect of the Reichstag fire does this help us to understand? Then, what does the source suggest about this? Can you use a quote to support that? Expand on that with your own knowledge. And again, commenting on the reliability of the source. So the final section, does it make it reliable? So I'm going to pause the video again, have a go at writing your second paragraph. Right, we'll have a look at mine now, and you can compare that to the one that you've written. Source D is useful because it helps us to understand that not everyone believes that the Reichstag fire was started by the communists, and some thought it was started by the Nazis themselves. The source states that more probably the fire was started by the Nazis. This is supported by the fact that the Nazis had a lot to gain from blaming the communists. Afterwards, the Reichstag fire decree made it possible to ban political parties, and this made it easier to make Germany a dictatorship. The authorship makes the source reliable because it was reported the day after the event. It is also from the point of view of a British journalist who would have been less afraid of criticising the Nazi Party than a German journalist at the time. So again, we've said, what does this show? It gives us the alternative view of, or the alternative theory about the cause of the Reichstag fire. What does the source say? It says it was started by the Nazis. And then expand on that with your own knowledge. Why would the Nazis have potentially blamed the communists? What did they gain from that? And then a comment on the authorship. So looking at your own answer, seeing if you've included those 4 things. Finally, in paragraph 3, you need to make a judgment. So which of the sources is more useful for a historian studying the Reichstag fire? So as I said before, sources are useful for different things. So both of the sources are useful in some way. But then you need to make a judgment about which one is more useful. And you need to justify that. So does one source give you more factual information? Does it give you more different points of view? Which of the sources is more useful to a historian? So have a go at making a judgment, and then we'll look at my example. Both sources are useful because they help us to understand the different theories about the causes of the Reichstag fire. However, source D is more useful than source C. Source C helps us understand who the Nazis blamed for the fire, but source D gives us information about who the Nazis blamed, and it also shows the alternative theory that some people had about the fire. So I've said they both show about the causes, but one of the sources is more useful because it shows information about both theories. Right, so we've looked back at how Hitler consolidated his power in this period, and you've had a go at answering a question 4. So if you now stop the video now and you can do your exit ticket, which will be in Google Classroom. Thanks, everyone.